Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Denise with T Education. So in this video, I wanted to give you my best tip on how you can think in English, like really start thinking in English without translating from your own language. This is actually very important because each language has its own grammar. And if we translate literally, sometimes it can work, but most of the times it doesn't. And I've been teaching English long enough to know that this is the case, first of all. Second of all, I was just working with this student of mine these past few weeks, and we're at the very early stages of learning, but I still couldn't get her to make very simple sentences. So I came up with this method and I tested it a couple of times and it really works. So I thought, why not share it with whoever needs to hear this? And so that's why I'm making this video today. So what I found is that the best way to stop translating from your own language is, drumroll, is to just know basic sentence structure in English. So if you know English grammar, and English grammar is a big world, but just the basic sentence structure, instead of thinking how to say each word from your language to English, you just have to fill in the blocks. What do I mean by that? Let's take a look at the basic sentence structure for all verbs except for the verb to be. We're going to do that later. So this is how to make a sentence in English, an affirmative sentence. So subject, verb, object. This, okay? So instead of thinking, how do I say this word from my language to English? How do I say this? Just think, subject, who makes the action? Verb, what is the action? And object, who receives the action. So I'm gonna make an example in Italian because that's my mother tongue. So for example, in Italian, we tend to omit the subject. So basically all sentences that don't have the subject, unless it's a command like eat, study, drink, all sentences, like except for these cases, if they don't have the subject, that's a technical mistake. That's just wrong. Right? So no matter if you're saying something very easy or something very advanced, if you don't say the subject, that's just wrong. So that's why I'm saying it's better to start from the very beginning, lay very good foundations, and then build up from that. And this is the most basic you can get. So subject, who makes the action? So instead of saying, for example, in Italian, that would be eat pizza, because I know that the sentence structure in English for an affirmative sentence is subject, verb, object, I have to think, what word do I put in the subject slot, let's say? And so I know that that's I. Verb, eat. Object, pizza. Okay? So again, instead of thinking, for example, in Italian, that would be mangio pizza. I don't say eat pizza because that's just wrong. I need to think, what word do I use for the subject? What word do I use for the verb? And what word do I use for the object? Let's take a look at the negative sentence. By the way, I'm making examples in Italian because this is my mother tongue, but it would be so fun to me and so interesting if you could write down in the comments below, like in your language, what is the basic sentence structure? So, because I'm thinking, like for example, in Chinese as well, it's the same, okay? So that would be the same advice for me. So just think, what is the subject? What is the verb and what is the object? But other languages, they don't require, for example, the subject, like English or Chinese, let's say. I'm digressing. So let's take a look at the negative sentence structure in English. Subject, auxiliary verb. So what is it? An auxiliary verb is just a word that helps me make the sentence negative. Just that. Verb, object. As you can see, it's basically the same thing. The only thing that differs is exactly this. So how do I turn this into a negative sentence? I just add an auxiliary verb. And what is the auxiliary verb in the present tense for all verbs except for the verb to be and sometimes have? Do, right? In the negative, don't. So instead of saying, for example, from the Italian, non mangio la pizza, translated in English, that would be not eat pizza. That's just wrong. I need to think, what is the subject? I, and that's already correct. Don't eat pizza. You see where I'm getting with this? So think of the slots. I need to think about the word for the subject, the word for the auxiliary verb, which is don't. That's always that. I don't even have to rack my brain into thinking. I just know that that's the way to turn a affirmative sentence into a negative one in the present tense, verb and object. Now, questions. So in English, the way to ask a question in the present tense is exactly the same as an affirmative sentence, but, and this is a very big but, auxiliary verb. I need to place an auxiliary verb, again, a word which function is just to turn a basic affirmative sentence into a question. Why do I say this? Because, for example, in Italian, the difference between an affirmative sentence and a question is just you go up with the voice. So, for example, mangi la pizza, mangi la pizza, it's the same exact thing, and that's why most Italian make this mistake, because they just go up with the voice. But in English, the way to ask a question, you always have to start, for the yes or no questions at least, you always have to start with the auxiliary verb. So, which is, for the present tense, do. So, do, and then what is the subject? You eat pizza. So it's not eat pizza, is do you eat pizza? You see how it differs? I don't have to think from my own language and translate this in English. I just have to think about the sentence structure and replace. So what word do I put in the slot of auxiliary verb for question? What for subject, what for verb, what for object? And this is for all verbs, except for the verb to be, which is the one that I'm getting at right now. Okay, so here we go. Now, the verb to be is a little different. As you can see, what is the most striking difference? The question, right? But let's start from the beginning first. So affirmative sentence is exactly the same. So if I want to say, okay, I have to say this in English, of course. So I am Italian, right? I am Italian. In Italian, I would just say, if I had to translate literally, that would be am Italian, because as we've seen, you're also learning a little bit of Italian, you don't say the subject, which is wrong. So again, what is the verb? What is the word that I have to put in the place of subject? What is the word in the place of verb? And what is the word in the place of object? Now, what about the negative sentence? Also, the negative differs a little bit from the other verbs because, as you can see, first there's the verb and then there is the auxiliary verb. So first, always the subject, but then I say the verb. So in the present, that is am for I. So let's say that the sentence is I am not Italian. It wouldn't be like in Italian, not Italian. It would be word for subject, I am not, the auxiliary verb to turn an affirmative sentence with the verb to be into a negative one is not. So I am not Italian, okay? And then again, the question, this is where it really changes, as you can see, is verb, subject, object. So again, to quote Italian, in Italian, that's just like for normal verbs, a question is just like an affirmative sentence, but you go up in voice. So that would be completely wrong because it would translate in English into something like, you Italian? Which, by the way, in spoken English is common, but it's technically not correct. And like I always say, it's good to have very good foundations and know the grammar, especially if you want to do like exams or like in the business world. Like you need to know the right grammar and then you can be flexible when you speak. So for questions, there's inversion. So first I say the verb. So are you, are is are because the subject is you. So are you Italian? And don't say you are Italian. That's wrong. Again, acceptable in spoken English, but technically grammatically wrong. So I have to turn it. Are you Italian? And I'm thinking the same, for example, is with Chinese. Chinese is the same exact structure, but you go up in voice. Instead of being, for example, the affirmative sentence, I am Italian, in Chinese would be 我是意大利人. And the question would be the same. 我是意大利人吗? Actually, yeah, you have to add a little particle that is used to make sentences, kind of like the auxiliary verb. But I'm just saying that basically this is just an example, or if I'm thinking French, French also has for the verb to be an auxiliary at the top. Okay, maybe I'm digressing. I'm talking about multiple languages, but what I'm saying is, no matter what your language is, do not think how to say the word in your language in English. Think of this. This is the structure. So when you have to make a sentence, just think, what is the word for? If I want to make a sentence with all verbs except for the verb to be, I need to think, what is the word for the subject? What is the word for the verb? What is the word for the object? And so on. This way, you make sure that you think directly in English. And as always, this is just at the beginning. So once you have the great foundations, you don't have to go back and you don't have to think about this every single time. But this is what you need to lay the foundations, and then just worry about the rest. Once this is established and you have very good foundations, then you can add on vocabulary. Then you can add on prepositions and articles and whatnot. But first, you need to start thinking in English from the very beginning. And what I found in my experience is that by knowing the basic sentence structure, you can replace the words and just make sure that it's correct, whether that being a very easy sentence or a more complex one. So I hope it made sense, some of it at least. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them below. And again, please write down, what is your native language? Is it the same structure as in English? I'm really curious. And so I hope this video was useful, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye!